Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Implementing Results-Based Accountability in the Children and Family Sector webinar. I'm Marquez Frazier with Clear Impact, and I'll be moderating our webinar today. To make sure you're in the right place, I wanted to remind you all what you signed up for. As you know, ensuring child and family well-being and protection faces a range of challenges. RBA, or Results-Based Accountability, provides a simple, disciplined framework to take action and measure the impact of prevention, early intervention, and protective services. By the end of today's webinar, you will have learned a few things, particularly some practical ways to implement RBA for child protection and well-being, have examples of performance measures for specific child and family support and intervention services, and explored success stories using RBA, and hopefully had a little fun in the process. Before we get started, I wanted to go over the rules of engagement for today. You all are muted. But there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. On the right-hand panel, there's an opportunity for you to type in questions, and we'll stop and break throughout the presentation to answer any questions that you may have. Again, today is going to be an interactive webinar, and so there will also be poll questions throughout, and on your screen, you'll be prompted to answer the poll questions. After the webinar, there will be a post-webinar survey that's sent out to everyone. By filling out the survey, you will gain access to the additional handouts as well as a link to the recorded webinar. So that will be made available to you as well. Karen, would you mind going to the next slide? Just as a brief overview, Clear Impact, we provide performance management software, training and services, including consulting and TA support to help government agencies, nonprofits, communities, and foundations track the performance of their programs. Our work is focused on improving the lives of children, families, and communities worldwide. Next slide, please. And you'll be able to follow us on social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter at the Clear Impact LLC name. And our panelists today, we're greeted by Karen Finn and Ann McIntyre-Liner. Karen is a partner and senior consultant with Clear Impact. She is a results-based accountability expert, particularly in the areas of children and families. She's a former chief of programs and policy at the Maryland's Governor's Office for Children, where she developed Maryland's three-year children's plan to improve targeted state indicators of child and family well-being. Thank you and welcome, Karen. And next, Ann is the Director of Performance Management for Connecticut's Department of Children and Families, the state's child welfare agency responsible for child protection, behavioral health, juvenile justice, and prevention services. Ann is the author of an upcoming book and accountability for Connecticut's children. And the name of her book is Stop Spinning Your Wheels, Using Results-Based Accountability to Steer Your Agency to Success. So thank you both, and I want to turn the floor over to you, Karen.
Thanks very much, Marquez. As Marquez said, what you're going to learn today is something we call to shoot for the moon.
Hey, Karen, I can't hear you.
Information. And so when we talk about this shooting for the moon, I just like to play a little piece from the past.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
So in the early 1960s, early in President Kennedy's presidency, he set this goal of in the end of the decade, in less than 10 years, we would land a man on the moon. And in 1969, this is what happened.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So in less than a decade, we landed a man on the moon. that would not have been possible if we didn't have this goal, this moonshot to look for. So at the very beginning of this webinar, what I would like you to do is think about where you sit in the child and family sector. What would be your moonshot? As you look down the road, 10 years, 15 years in the future, what would be the equivalent of a moonshot? What would be the difference that you would hope to see in 10 years? So take a minute and think about that, and then when you think about this moonshot, does it fit into one of these categories? We're taking a poll now, so I want you to ask lives, families are nurturing and economically stable, or something else. So I'm going to give you about a minute to select. Okay. I'm told that you can't hear me.
Sorry, stop.
Okay. And we see the poll. Excellent. You guys are answering it. Got about 77% of our folks have voted. Give you about 15 seconds more. Okay, I think we can close the poll and share the results. So we've got most folks answering in the families are nurturing and economically stable, and youth are ready to lead successful lives. And then a few in children are safe, and babies born healthy. Great, wonderful. Thank you for answering that poll. And if you just give me a minute. So we're back to those different areas that you are looking at, and what in results-based accountability we call this moonshot, our results, or some places call it their outcomes, or as you'll see in New York, they refer to it as their touchstone goals. What is that big goal that you want to get to, that you want to achieve in the future? And so we're going to talk about a couple of examples. In Baltimore, they were looking in babies born healthy and the infant mortality rate, and brought together partners, and we'll tell you a little bit about that story and how they turned the curve on infant mortality. In Orange County, New York, they brought together a community convening of multiple partners, over 100 partners together, to look at different moonshots or results, touchstone goals and indicators, and one of the ones they turned the curve on is this young adults driving while intoxicated, so you can see the improvement of that. In Connecticut, Anne will be talking with you about how they implemented results-based accountability throughout their system, and one of the things they're proudest of is this turning of the curve of having children residing safely with families and children in kinship care. And then finally in Nebraska, they were looking at all of their contracted services, coming up with common performance measures and working together to turn the curve. And one thing they found some improvement in is the percentage of youth remaining in their homes, in their home school, even if they were in foster care. So how do we get from this announcement, like President Kennedy had, to landing that man on the moon? Or where you are right now within your organizations and within your communities and achieving your moonshot. This is just a slide, a picture of part of the Apollo team. And so it takes a lot of people and a lot of computer power. But one of the things I've learned recently that I found very interesting is that the computer power that they were working with at the time is not as powerful as each of our smartphones. And so we have that power, we have the resources to achieve your moonshot. We just need to have a framework to get us there. So what we're proposing is using results-based accountability. This is a simple framework based on the work of Mark Friedman, who wrote the book Trying Hard is Not Good Enough. The work in the children and family sector, as Marquez was saying, can be very complex. You've got human beings, you've got children, you've got families, you've got complex bureaucracies, and so you need a simple framework to help make sense of this, to help bring those partners together, and to really get from talk to action, as we say. So what is this simple framework? It's basically a disciplined way of thinking and taking action that communities can use to improve the children, youth, and families to achieve your moonshot or your community as a whole. It also can be used on the programmatic level for programs, agencies, and service systems to improve the performance and the quality of the work that you're doing and the difference that you're making for your customers and the individuals you serve. I started using results-based accountability about 20 years ago. I was the administrator of a human services council in a small county in Maryland, and our job was to improve the well-being of all the children and families in our community. And I felt like I had a lot of burden on my shoulders, and how am I going to do that? But I had the superintendent of schools, the head of social services, the head of mental health, health department, and juvenile services, plus the community. But my job was to get them to focus not on their individual agencies or components, but on the children and families and the well-being of them as a whole in our county. And that's when I started and discovered results-based accountability, which was just beginning to be used in Maryland and in Vermont and in some other places. And it helped all those different agencies to focus on what is the well-being, youth leading successful lives, babies being born healthy, that we all can focus on together and improve. And so that was my start with results-based accountability, and I think this can also be used throughout the children and family sectors, and now I use it also in the health and other areas. So it is a simple framework. There are some various components, and there are some key principles to keep in mind. One is that we need to identify the appropriate level of accountability. Are you working primarily on the whole community or the population level, or are you thinking more about programmatic? So when you think about your moonshot, was it something you were hoping for all the kids in your particular community and families, or kids or families or youth in your particular program? There's just slightly different ways, different measurements for each of those, and different questions. And so we're going to give you some examples on both that population and community level and also the programmatic level. One of the most important principles of results-based accountability is this idea of starting with your moonshot. Start at the end. Where do you want to end up? What is that condition of well-being you want? How do you want the participants in your program to be better off? And then work your way backwards to means. And results-based accountability provides essential questions to do what we call turn the curve. How do we improve the particular measure that we're looking at? Whether that's an indicator of infant mortality or a performance measure of the percentage of kids in foster care who will remain in their home school. There's 7 questions, and we'll talk about those in a minute. We all experience a lot of data. We need to use data to make decisions and to plan and give us some feedback about, are we getting where we want to go? But in results-based accountability, we talk about using the fewest number of most powerful measures, whether that would be an indicator on the community level or a performance measure on your organizational level. You don't want to inundate people with data. You want the fewest number, the powerful measures that provide you with feedback of how are we doing and how can we get better and better at what we're trying to do. Just as in the Apollo program, we need partners at every level. No one service system, agency, or program can improve things and be held accountable for measures at the whole population or community level. You've got to have partners to help you. But even in your program, if you want your customers to get jobs, to get housing, to be in families that love and nurture them, you need partners to help you to do that. And finally, one of my favorite principles of results-based accountability is to get quickly from talk to action. You want to be thoughtful about it, but we spend so much time talking about these complex issues and not getting into action. In results-based accountability, we do the thought, the thinking, we look deeply into issues, and then we try stuff out, and we have the best actions that we can think of, and then we continuously look to see if we're getting better and better at what we're trying to improve. So as I said, our examples will be at both the population level. I'm going to talk briefly about Baltimore and babies being born healthy and some of what's going on in Maryland. And we'll talk about the Connecticut Kids Report Card on the population level. And I will talk about a process called Achieving Youth Results in New York State, and one example in Orange County of youth ready to live successful lives. And then at the program level, talk a little bit about what New York State Office of Children and Families is doing with their performance measures, and we'll talk about the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. And I'll give you an example of how in Nebraska we did something called Metric Madness, but involved providers and the state to come up with a set of performance measures that everyone thought were the best performance measures to use. So we talk about getting from talk to action, and these 7 questions to turn the curve or improve that measure on the population level you see on your screen. What is the end that you seek? What is that moonshot? How are we doing? That's a measure, the indicator. What is the story behind the data? What are the causes and forces at work? Who are our partners? We want to think about partners at every step along the way, but after we talk about the factors that might contribute to what's going on in our own community or our own program, then we want to think, well, what other partners do we need to involve? We want to do some very innovative work around what works to do better. We want to make sure that we don't throw away what's currently working while we look for other things to add to it. And then we want to prioritize those ideas about what works, including low-cost, no-cost ideas, and at least one off-the-wall idea, and come up with what are the most effective and efficient strategies that will help us to have the leverage to improve our indicator and are feasible and affordable and within our community and organizational values. And then finally, we look at what is our action plan and budget. So let's look at those questions again and how they worked in Baltimore, Maryland, when they addressed the issue of infant mortality. So on your screen, you can see the questions to the left, and I left off the last one, which is the action plan and budget, just trying to simplify this a little bit in this example. On the right is a template that at the end of this webinar, you're going to be sent a survey. And if you answer that survey, you're going to get a couple of handouts. One of those is a results-based accountability workbook, which kind of takes you through this whole process from population level to performance level and provides some templates so that you can do this work. So one of them looks very similar to this. What is the end that you seek? In this example, it was babies born healthy, that condition of well-being or result that Baltimore wanted for all of its kids. 2, how are we doing? You can see a graph there that we've pulled from the Clear Impact Scorecard, which can help you track these results, indicators, and performance measures. And so at the peak of that infant mortality in about 2009, Baltimore, with the help of the State Health Department, the local health department, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Family League of Baltimore, and a number of other partners, brought folks together in the community to really dive deeply into this issue, explore what the story behind the baseline was, and come up with a comprehensive set of strategies to address it. And so I like to give this example because what's interesting about it is that in other locations, the cause or forces at work in infant mortality is more likely to be, along with preterm and low birth weight, congenital abnormalities. But in Baltimore, what they found was preterm and low birth weight baby was a significant causal factor or contributing factor. But what was the second most important one was unsafe sleep for babies. And so you have to start with the story behind the baseline. What are the factors that contribute in your particular community in order for you to lead to strategies that are going to address those contributing factors? If you really want to make a difference, you've got to focus on what's going on in your own community. Question number 4, who are partners with the role to play? I talked about some of the partners they brought together to look at this indicator, and then once they looked at the causes and forces at work, they found that they needed over 100 other partners. That included the media, included faith-based organizations, local physicians, and others throughout the community. This was a community-wide effort. And then you look at what works and what do we propose to do, and they did a lot of brainstorming, comprehensive strategies, and some of the key ones are listed there of Safe Sleep campaign. So they had that issue that was different in Baltimore than other places. Smoking cessation, evidence-based home visiting for families that were experiencing their first time, their first child, and also some significant challenges. Looked at teen pregnancy prevention and Be More Fit. It's a comprehensive strategy. And all of this fits within a larger system in Maryland that looks at, in addition to babies born healthy, 8 other child well-being results, each with their own indicators that communities can look at. And they have a system of local management boards that on a regular basis, just like I did 20 years ago when I learned about results-based accountability, bring together these different partners, look at their results and indicators, and come up with community-wide strategies to address these. So the next example I would like to talk about is the New York State Office for Children and Family Services. And they're looking at RBA on those 2 levels also, similarly to Maryland. So they look on the population level, right now calling some of the work that they do Achieving Youth Results. And on the population level, they tie it to this idea of what they call touchstones. These were developed by the Council on Children and Families, bringing together over 12 child-serving agencies in New York, and identify what is it the difference we're trying to make on the whole community. And they call those touchstones or touchstone goals. That's their moonshot. That's their conditions of well-being. On the programmatic level, they have a system called youth bureaus, and youth bureaus did a lot of different services, opportunities, supports, and programs for youth in their local jurisdictions. But in New York, they streamlined those so that they could get a set of common performance measures, so they could say something about the difference that youth bureaus were making throughout the whole state. I'm going to give you just a little example of on both of these levels. This Achieving Youth Results is their approach to the population level. It's an interagency, community-wide planning process. And the key components are that they have an interagency and community leadership team that takes a look at the touchstone goals or their moonshot and indicators, prioritizes what they really need to have a comprehensive, collaborative approach to improving, look at those measures, and then the heart of it is these community convenings in various neighborhoods and communities that involved youth, involved community members. They looked for common themes, and in addition to county-wide strategies, they looked for low-cost and no-cost ideas and actions that community members can take right away while they're developing a more long-term strategic plan. So these community convenings are meetings of about sometimes 100 different partners. In one county, they had 80 of these community convenings and brought together over 450 community partners. In another, they had 2 or 3 meetings with about 100, 120 community partners. So there's different ways that you can do it, but the heart of it and the common thing that they have is they look at a touchstone goal or that condition of well-being. In this case, youth will leave school prepared to live, learn, and work in their communities. And they look at separate indicators, and people would meet in tables across this big room and delve into those contributing factors for their particular community. In this case, they're looking at kind of a decrease overall in their graduation rate, and what were some of the factors that contributed to that, using those turn the curve questions to get from ends to means and talk to action, and came up with their action plans and what they proposed to do. They're now piloting this in other communities throughout New York State. On the program level, I've been working with New York State for the last couple of years and their youth bureaus to come up with common performance measures that they're tracking through the Clear Impact Scorecard. So they had over about 150 what they called programs or services, opportunities, or supports, and they streamlined those down to about 30 different ones. And again, if you answer the survey at the end of this, we're going to give you some examples of some of these performance measures. So we involved the youth bureaus themselves and the state staff and did a brainstorming process for each of these 30 or 35 programs. What are possible performance measures in each of these results-based accountability categories, which are how much did you do? So the number of customers served, the number of activities, how well did you do it, or the quality of those services or efforts, and then is anyone better off? For your particular program service, the people that are within that program, are they better off as a result of being a part of your program? In what ways are they better off? Another way to put it sometimes is we talk about customer outcomes or client outcomes. So is anyone better off? Try to really look at a jargon-free approach to performance management and performance accountability. Excuse me. But we want to make sure that we have the fewest number, again, of most powerful performance measures in each one of these categories. So currently, the youth bureaus, having the common performance measures helps them to be able to, in every county and jurisdiction across the state, collect common performance measures for that particular program, and then they put it in the Clear Impact Scorecard, and we're able to aggregate up in 2017. They'll have data in there that they can say something about what is the difference these programs are making across the state. And so on this slide, you just see a couple of examples from screenshots from the Clear Impact Scorecard for mental health supports, the how much, how well, and better off measures that anybody in the state that through the youth bureaus is providing mental health supports will be collecting this data. And when you put it into the scorecard, you have, the time period, the actual value, and you click on any one of these performance measures, and you can do that turn the curve process where they look at the actual data over time and can have a conversation about what are some of the factors that contribute, who are the partners that we need to help us get better and better at this, and what do we propose to do. The other example I'm showing is just one other one on permanency supports. And again, you can see kind of fewest number of most powerful performance measures. And so when we're talking about something like how well, this could be as simple as youth satisfaction, or they're looking at percentage of youth with two or less placements within 1 year. And then better off, what percentage of youth do not have a repeat maltreatment, and what percentage of youth and families are completing their goals in their permanency plan. So just some examples of how that might work. So that was a lot of information. What we'd like to do is just pause for questions. And Marquez, do we have any questions that we'd like to look at this time?
Yes. Would you mind sort of expanding the idea once you look at the population results? There's a question around this being a bit broad and generalized. How will you know if you achieve the population level goal? So I guess that's more along the lines of an indicators question. But the question again is around how will you know if you've achieved the population level goal as right now, the way in which it's been spelled out and seems to be broad?
Great question. So the result or the condition of well-being, like babies born healthy, youth will lead successful lives, they are broad and intentionally broad and positive. It's the sort of thing that can really bring people together. But your question is very good, so how do you know if you've made a difference? And that's where we use the indicator measure. For instance, in the Baltimore example, they were looking at rate of infant mortality. And so you look at it at trends over time and try to look when they were looking at 2009, it was heading up very steeply. And so where do we want that to go? We want to turn the curve down and look at those 7 questions and what are the causes and forces at work, the partners, what works. And then you have to keep going back to that measurement again. And they saw a decrease pretty significantly the first couple of years, but this is an ongoing process, and the indicator on the population level gives you that feedback that you need to know, are we headed in the right direction? And if not, it's not necessarily that your strategies are wrong or your causes and forces are wrong. You have to really dig a little deeper, disaggregate some of that data, and figure out what do we think is going on now and how do we address that. So it's an ongoing basis using indicators to give you that more specific feedback about whether you're headed in the right direction.
Great, thank you, Karen. There's one more question. It's around the design of performance measures and particularly the is anyone better off measure. Since it's typically framed in a yes or no question, is anyone better off? Are there any thoughts on how to get people more involved in sort of evolving performance measures so it becomes a bit more challenging? So again, many people stop short in the design of performance measures for the anyone better off measures, as it's yes or no, and your thoughts on how to sort of expand it to sort of broaden the work and sort of deepen the work around measuring progress beyond just a yes or no measure, but to see if there's any way that we can sort of track performance around better off measures.
Also a great question. So yes, is anyone better off is, again, kind of a broad question. The workbook that we're going to provide for you does take you through the steps as Mark Friedman outlines them in his book, the 5 steps to select performance measures. And so you brainstorm within each of those categories, and when you're looking at is anyone better off, you want to ask people a couple of questions. Sort of the first is still a broad question, but the first question is, if your program worked perfectly, you had the best staff, you had all your resources, what is the difference that you think you would make in your youth lives or families' lives or kids' lives? And you brainstorm all that without really thinking yet about how are we specifically going to measure that. You want to first get people's thinking in terms of a broader approach to this. What are you trying to achieve? And further prompts can be, is this program meant to improve youth skills, say employment skills or the soft skills involved in employment, or parenting skills? Then how would you measure whether they actually achieve those skills? You also can prompt, are we trying to change somebody's attitude or opinion? So think about that, and then how maybe we do a pre and a post test around people's attitudes or opinions. Is what we're trying to do, the third way you think about it is behavior. So we're trying to get people to quit smoking, or pregnant moms to quit smoking, or to eat better, or kids to stop drinking and driving. So you think about the behaviors that you may be trying to change. And then the last category is usually circumstance. If what you're trying to do is get kids in permanent placements, what percentage of them are in adoption, or if they're older, in independent living. If you're doing housing, what percentage of families are now not homeless anymore and they have safe housing. So prompting in each one of those categories, I think, really gets to the more specific performance measures. And I'd like to ask Anne if she has anything to add to that one, because then I'm going to turn it over to Anne to talk about the Connecticut story. So Anne, any additions to getting more specific performance measures?
No, I think that you did a really super job of outlining it, and I think as I go through some of my slides, I will probably, just as part of my presentation, enhance that a bit.
Okay. Marquez, were that the two questions we wanted to cover?
There is just one more. I think we may have time for one more. And so the question is around how do we get the information public as to bring other partners to the table? And are there any suggestions and ways to sort of benchmark across different communities that may be measuring similar performance measures?
So I'll take that and then again turn it over to you, Anne. One of the things, I've got a couple cautions there, let me say, about benchmarking across communities, because one of the things that sometimes causes a little anxiety around performance measures is this whole idea of comparing one program to another program or one geographic area to another geographic area where the circumstances may be entirely different. So I did not express this as a key principle of results-based accountability, but it is a key principle that we never present data without the story behind. If you just look at data without knowing what are some of the causes and forces at work in that community or that program, you can draw some conclusions that are not fair and not accurate. So that's one thing about benchmarking. However, one of the things about using the Clear Impact Scorecard in New York is that, and in other places, that you can look at how other people are doing and then also look at what were some of the strategies that they tried, what is some of the story behind the data in that particular area. So if you have something like a scorecard or a dashboard or something that collects data over time and in different geographic places, you can talk. I would again caution, but make sure you're looking at it in terms of how do we learn from each other, how do we all get better and better. And just because something's working in one community, it may not work in the other community, but we still can have that conversation and learn from one another. And Anne, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with not comparing one community or one agency against another. And having said that, we can all learn a lot from each other's successes and challenges. One thing that Clear Impact is doing now is building a global library of curves that have been turned. And I know that that's not yet published and is in process. And I think that would be something for participants to look for in the future, because it's a great way to understand what has worked in other areas. And again, I would just tag on Karen's caution: don't compare oneself against another organization, but remain open to be able to learn from other people's ideas and what's worked in other communities.
Yep, terrific. And those are all of the questions that we have for now.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Anne, so I think I have your slide up now, if you'd like to take over for a little bit.
Absolutely. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, Marquez and Eileen and the Clear Impact team for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I'm going to jump right in with the Connecticut Kids Report Card. This is our population level work. And although most of what I'm going to talk about is the work of the department I work at, Connecticut Department of Children and Families, I think it's important to start at the population level to ground our work. Our result for all children in Connecticut is that all Connecticut's children live in stable environments, are safe, healthy, and ready to lead successful lives. Now, you can see that this result is kind of complex. It has 4 different parts. And the 4 parts of our result statement, stability, safety, health, and future success, are treated like mini individual result statements, each with its own set of headline and secondary indicators to measure how we're doing. And while I'm not going to go into detail about the report card, I do want to reference it because, again, the work starts at the population level. The Connecticut Kids Report Card was based on some important legislation by Representative Diana Urban, and it was developed with about 150 parents, advocates, providers, educators, and state and local agency representatives. It uses the Clear Impact Scorecard to share data and track our progress for all kids in Connecticut. And most importantly for this presentation, it provides a population-level framework for the performance work of Connecticut's Department of Children and Families. Can we have the next slide, please? So a little bit about Connecticut's DCF. So we have 5 mandated areas that include children's protective services, behavioral health, education for those children in our care, statewide prevention, and we share responsibility for the state's juvenile justice system with the Connecticut Judicial Branch. We run 4 facilities, and we have a central office and 14 area offices that are organized into 6 regions. We've got over 3,200 employees and approximately 100 types of contracted services with numerous provider partners across the state. On any year, we serve about 36,000 children and 16,000 families. Next slide, thank you. So our RBA effort in Connecticut is a comprehensive effort that includes staff, provider, and community training and support, the development of DCF's strategic plan and the management of our agency performance, the development and management of performance measures for our contracted services, and creating and continuing a culture of performance management within the agency. And I'll go through each one of these efforts individually, starting with the staff, provider, and community training and support. Our management teams across the agency have been trained in RBA through our own local efforts and also by Phil Lee of Clear Impact. And we provide ongoing technical assistance through an in-house function. Our program leads, our provider partners, community groups, and other agencies and individuals have also been trained using RBA 101, in-house development, training specifically designed on developing and using performance measures. We have developed an RBA affinity group at DCF that meets on a quarterly basis to provide support and topical training for our staff members who are involved in RBA work. And we take an active and leadership role in Connecticut's RBA practitioner network. And that network is a loosely affiliated group that brings together practitioners and people who'd like to learn more about RBA from across the state. We offer free RBA 101 training, and we hold quarterly meetings that focus on different RBA topics. So as we look at the development of our strategic plan and management in-house, our strategic plan at DCF was designed to align with the population level result that children live in stable environments, are safe, healthy, and ready to lead successful lives. The agency has 7 cross-cutting themes and 9 overarching strategies that have been distilled into our commissioner's annual performance expectation and department-wide performance measures. Our 2016 performance expectations are the following 5. 1, exit from the WAN-F consent decree. 2, ensure that children reside safely with families whenever possible and appropriate. 3, achieve racial justice across the DCF system. 4, prepare children and adolescents in care for success. And 5, prepare and support the workforce to meet the needs of children and families. Our management teams identify their contribution in achieving the performance expectation, and they develop strategies and performance measures for their strategies. I'm going to tell you that some of our teams have needed a lot of technical assistance in developing their strategies, while others have really sailed through on their own. They use data, regular reporting, to improve their performance and to really focus on how they're doing and what they need to continue doing to turn the curve. The agency teams meet regularly, as in on a quarterly basis, with the commissioner and her team to celebrate their achievements, but also to identify where they need to improve their strategies, or try something different so that they continue their progress for the next quarter and throughout the rest of the year. May I have the next slide, please? So developing and working on performance measures for our contract services. So this really was probably the very first thing that we delved into with our RBA work at DCF. And we started out with a review of the existing outcomes section of all of our different contracts. And what that review told us was that many things that we had been measuring or considering important really were not outcomes. They were important to include in contracts, but should not be confused with performance measures or outcomes. Those things included staffing levels, hours of operation, contract capacity, and program descriptions. And I will tell you that we also found some things that really were pretty good performance measures that focused on outcomes. So our review allowed us to begin to prioritize programs for development of RBA performance measures based on their importance to the commissioner's performance expectation, how much money we were spending on each service statewide, the number of locations of each service across the state, and the amount of work that was going to be required to develop RBA measures for those services. So we began our work jointly with our provider partners to develop RBA performance measures, again, after we had prioritized which programs we'd be focusing on first, and then working our way across the system. And I will tell you that that joint work is a really key piece when you're engaging in this kind of work. So on the next page, Karen, if you could turn to the next slide, I've got an example of our new catalog. So after doing that original cataloging of our former performance measures, we engaged in the performance measure development work. And then as we began to develop our measures, we developed a new catalog. And that was a catalog of our RBA performance measures. So we grouped our services into general services types. So what you're looking at on this page is a sample of our behavioral health services. So on the left-hand side, you can see the general category. The next column shows the types of programs that are included in the category. And the following three columns show generic performance measures. How much did we do? How well did we do it? And is anyone better off? And I'll tell you, we kept these measures in the catalog only. But in the catalog, we kept our measures fairly generic so that they could be easily modified across the different program types, and people wouldn't get too wigged out by looking at something that was specifically designed for one type of program. On the right-hand column, you'll see that there's a place to enter the data source. And one of our lessons learned in Connecticut was how important it is to identify the data source as well as the amount of work that it'll take to understand the data and to be able to develop it into a meaningful measure for your report card. Next slide, please. So we're talking about performance accountability, and let's take another poll here. People have a lot of different feelings about accountability. That might include fear and trembling. It's necessary and beneficial. It's just more meaningless corporate jargon. OMG, it's about to go down. And finally, we're getting some useful feedback. So let's take about 30 seconds for all of you to enter in your feelings about performance accountability as we move forward. Okay, so it looks like we've got our answers. most of you are not fearful of performance accountability. That's a great thing. Most people on the call see it as necessary and beneficial. I agree, but there's still also a large number of you that are saying, finally, some useful feedback. So it sounds like people have a pretty open and receptive feeling about performance accountability. That's great, and I'd like to jump into talking about how we developed a culture of performance management at DCF. Karen, whenever you're ready, the next slide, please.
Okay, sorry, I ran into little technical difficulties, but there you go.
No problem. So I'll talk about creating and managing a culture of performance management both within DCF and our contracted services. Next slide, please. Whether your performance management efforts are internal or external, there are a number of things in common and that are important to keep in mind. So you want to make sure that you work in a regular review of your performance data, including quarterly RBA report cards and or other types of performance reviews, making sure that you don't just report numbers, but as Karen said earlier, understanding the story behind the baseline, jointly working with your partners to develop actions to turn the curve, and a systematic review of your work at the agency level, and then most importantly, don't put it away until next quarter, but on an ongoing basis, use what you're learning from your report cards to improve performance. Next slide, please. So creating a culture of performance management within DCF. What that includes for us is that our regional, divisional, and facility management teams have developed their own strategies and performance measures that help us measure how they're doing towards achieving the Commissioner's performance expectation. As I said before, we hold quarterly meetings with each team to review their performance, to identify those areas where they really are turning the curve and making a difference, and then also to identify additional actions to turn the curve, and also look at some areas where they're not doing so hot and they need some assistance. Management teams also have the opportunity to learn from each other's successes so they don't need to reinvent the wheel. Now on the next couple of slides, I've got some examples to show you. One of the 4 facilities that I talked about before is our Solnit Center. And you can see a dramatic increase in treatment team attendance here. Let me tell you a little bit about the strategy that went along with this. Not surprising in a large bureaucracy, we have historically scheduled treatment teams at the convenience of our staff and then invited parents and kids to join us. Well, this management team realized that wasn't doing so hot as far as attendance went. So they switched the focus of scheduling meetings so that meetings were planned around families and children's schedules. And after we found out what worked for families and kids, we then invited our staff members to attend. And as you can see, by switching our focus, we were able to dramatically increase family participation in these meetings. Next slide, please. Keeping children with families is a major focus of Commissioner Katz. And you can see that since her arrival at the agency in 2011, there's been a significant increase in the percentage of children who've been placed with family members instead of traditional foster care or congregate, i.e. facility-based care. And so this is with a careful and intentional focus and many different strategies from many different management teams across the agency. You can see that we've gone from a very low percentage of children placed with kin to a much more significant program. And as the years go by, we continue to increase on a regular and systematic basis. Next slide, please. So now let me talk about creating and sustaining a culture of performance management with our contracted services and our provider partners. We've developed quarterly report cards that on a regular basis we look at and analyze at a management group meeting within the agency. and also our program leads and our providers look at the data together. We provide ongoing training and support on an in-house basis and through the RBA practitioner network, again, to our program leads that work for the agency and our provider partners. And our program leads and our providers work together to develop actions to turn the curve. And I'll tell you, this last point is really important. And I would say that to assure that people's response to performance management is not that response of fear and trembling, but that we jointly achieve the outcomes that we're all striving for, that we all come together to this work, it's important to identify performance measures together and then work together to achieve those measures. And on the next couple of slides, we've got some examples. This first slide that I'm showing you is the strategy was to provide support to relative caregivers for children, relative children in care.
Excuse me, somebody's talking smack while I'm on the phone. Are they trying to run their mouth while I'm on the phone so I don't hear? What?
We need to mute people. Okay, go ahead, Ann, I think.
Okay. So what you can see is a result here is that by delivering this service to family caregivers, we were able to keep an increasing percent of children in family settings and not relying on a higher level of care. Next slide, please. The high-risk infant program is a program for pregnant moms in prison, and our program lead and our providers worked with facility staff members, facility as in the prison, to actually schedule classes based around the facility schedule and not in competition with the facility schedule, so that you can see by some simple and common sense strategies, we were able to dramatically increase the percentage of women who were able to participate in the services. This last example that I'm going to show you is another one, a very simple strategy, that of providing foster families with camp dates early in the planning process. It allowed foster families to make their summer plans around this important service and incorporating this important service into their family plans. And the year that we started releasing dates early on, you can see a dramatic spike in both the number of children who were able to participate in the service and the number of sibling groups. I've recently, as in a couple of days ago, just received the current summer's data, and by continuing with this same strategy, we've been able to maintain a very high level of participation of individual children and sibling groups. Karen, I'd like to turn it back to you now to talk about some other jurisdictions.
Great, thanks very much, Ann. So I just want to briefly talk about the process with Nebraska Children and Family Services to point out something that I think is important. I think Ann talked about too, but getting provider input and how do you help people to buy into this culture of performance management and buy into the performance measures themselves and get the best set of performance measures. And so Nebraska Division of Children and Family Services, I worked with them a couple of years ago. They wanted to develop outcomes for their contracted services within Children and Family Services. So things like agency-supported foster care, respite care, emergency shelter care, family support, in-home safety, and intensive family preservation. And what they wanted to do was have a set of common performance measures across all their contractors and then have them report in and be able to aggregate that up on a statewide basis. So we worked together, and I'll tell you some of the key lessons learned, but this slide is just about how do we get the input from both agency staff and also providers and come up with the fewest number of most powerful performance measures that had the best thinking of both groups. And so I call this slide and this process metric madness. I'm a big women's basketball fan, and so March Madness is a big deal to me. And so if you look on the left-hand side of this slide where it says agency staff, that picture screenshot is just a look at the actual form that we used. I trained over 1,000 agency staff along with one of the folks, Nathan Bush from Nebraska Children and Family Services. In that training, we had people brainstorm what could be all the possible performance measures using that 5-step process of Mark Friedman's. In each of those categories, how much do we do, how well do we do it, and is anyone better off? And so we brainstormed all those, then looked at what do we currently collect data. And on the right-hand side, you see we did the same thing with the providers. So we had trainings with the providers, divided them into groups based on these different types of services, and brainstormed the how much, how well, and is anyone better off, looked at what they had data for, and then of those things they collected data, came up with a common list of the most powerful performance measures and prioritized performance measures both on the agency staff and provider. Then we set up webinars where providers and agency staff were on the phone at the same time and came up with our final 4, if you would, in the middle. So the combined set that they thought was most important. And one of the things that we learned from that was, one, a lot of the state staff didn't understand that providers were already collecting data on some very important measures. And the providers learned some of the federal regulations and other regulations and pressures that the state agency staff were under. And so it was a good conversation about and really thinking about what are we trying to accomplish with each of these contracted services. And then they came to an agreement, and that's what you see kind of on the bottom, the championship performance measures that they agreed to, and then went into their Clear Impact Scorecard. Each agency that provides each of these services across the state collects data on the same performance measures, puts them into their scorecard, and it's automatically aggregated up into a statewide scorecard. And then they work together in partnership to use that turn the curve process. So looking at these measures, looking at the trends over time, and talking about what are some of the factors contributing to this and how can we get better and better at this. And that leads to the example I gave in the beginning, which is really having more and more kids remaining in their home school. If they have to go into foster care, they at least can stay in their home school and not lose the time in education. So some of the lessons that we learned in Nebraska were, and these actually go across probably the different other examples that we've given, and I have the next slide talks about even more lessons learned, and Ann and I will comment on that. But in Nebraska, one of the things I learned was that the highest level of leadership support is a must. They talked about having our RBA, the director's RBA champions, and leadership was very involved in this whole process. You really need to build the capacity throughout the system. So consequently, we trained all 1,000 CFS staff throughout the state, including support staff, so that they had a sense of what is it we're trying to accomplish. We also provided advanced training for an RBA work group, and we took this work group from people that were excited about this process, that saw it necessary and beneficial, that they saw it as most of you do on this call, good feedback. And I found that and felt that in Nebraska, and the providers and the agency felt that the highest quality product results from this collaborative effort of across system partners. So some of those lessons were also repeated in the other examples that we gave you. This idea of having a core group of internal stakeholders. And again, go with those people that show a passion for this, that are see the necessary and beneficial aspects of it, and build that capacity within your own organizations or your own communities. I probably said this about 10 times, but I don't think you can say it often enough. In a lot of my work throughout the country, we find that people want to keep saying, oh, but we want to collect this data, we want to collect that data. You really want the fewest number of most powerful performance measures, because we want to look at those on a regular basis, get that feedback, and get better and better at it. I love what Ann said about the quarterly RBA report cards and these management meetings where you constantly go back to the data and involve people in being solution-oriented and solution-focused, using those turn-the-curve questions of results-based accountability. I believe we also said this earlier, we want to avoid this gotcha approach. In Nebraska, they had talked about, there had been this feeling, and in other places that I've worked, that, okay, the reason we want to use these performance measures is just to point fingers, or to look for, sometimes people call it the scapegoat approach. We really want to think of it as more feedback. How do we get better and better and better at what we're trying to do, about the most important things that we're trying to do? And so you want to involve staff and contractors, the community. I find when we're talking about youth, it seems funny that you'd have to mention it, but involve the youth, involve the customers themselves. See what it is they're hoping to get out of the services and programs that you provide. Involve them in selecting the performance measures, and also in this idea of turn-the-curve thinking. The times I have done turn-the-curve meetings or community convenings with youth, and we're talking about real youth indicators and conditions of well-being we're trying to improve, they give the best answers about what are some of the contributing factors, what is the story behind the data, what is it they're living every day of their lives. And so you get some of the best thinking doing that. And whether you're looking at the population, community level, or the programmatic and customer level, you really want to focus on the better off thinking. Throughout Nebraska, lots of people just put a little sign on their computer monitor that said, you know, is anyone better off from the work that I'm doing today? Think about, from the population level, what's your moonshot? And when you think about the programmatic level, what's that customer's moonshot? Where do they hope to be in 5 years or 10 years? What is the real difference you can make in their life? And I want to ask Ann, from all the work that you've done, if you want to add to some of these lessons learned, or overemphasize them again. And so what were your lessons learned?
Well, I love the idea of getting rid of the gotcha approach, because it's kind of scary, and I think that's where we all, our minds sometimes want to take us. But there's one that's really important, and it's reflected on the next slide. Change is hard. I mean, change is great when it's your idea, right? You have an idea, it's great. But especially in large organizations, you're working hard, you're doing what you believe is the right thing, what you've been rewarded to do, what you've been trained to do and taught to do, and then all of a sudden someone says, you know, hold the press, we're changing how you do your job, we're changing how you work. So it is very hard, and my thought is, cut yourself a break and cut your colleagues a break, and realize that it's going to take time. You know, you've got the early adopters that Karen was talking about, and that's great. But realize for some others, it's harder to change how you're thinking, and it takes time, and it takes space, and it takes a lot of support. It can absolutely be done, but just remember, it's a hard process, and anything that you can do to help your colleagues change and to support that change will pay you back.
Great, thank you. And so we've covered a lot of ground today. I like to leave you at this point, but we're going to open it up for some questions, and we'll also tell you about kind of what's next after the questions. But as you think about the children and family sector, the work that you do, they are complex issues that we all are working with. And so the kind of thought I'd like to leave you with is that complex issues require, one, a compelling moonshot. So this idea of something that really can focus your attention, focus other people's attention, bring partners together. And so you need this compelling moonshot. You need committed partners. I think someone in the last round of questions asked about, how do you get that feedback, and these are kind of broad, how do you know if you're making a difference? So you really look at that measurement, but you need committed partners for the long haul, particularly when you're looking at the community level and trying to achieve this moonshot. And then finally, I think you need the courage to act. It's easy to talk about things. It's harder to act. And so I just hope that you will think about that moonshot very often, bring those committed partners together, and then all of you have the courage to act and make things better and better for the children and families that you serve. And with that, I'd like to ask Marquez if we have any questions before we talk about kind of next steps.
Sure, certainly. Thank you, Karen. So relating back to your work, and we do have one question in regards to the prioritization of programs and what type of performance information you had in using the performance measurement data to inform the prioritization of programs when you all did the work in Connecticut.
So is the question about how we did the prioritization?
Exactly, and how the performance measure data inform the prioritization of programs.
Okay, so what we did was we first took a look at all the existing, what we then called outcomes, or those things that I guess we considered important at the time, and we categorized them, and it ended up being into about 22 different categories, including some that really truly had no outcomes at all. And then we looked at how important is this particular program to the commissioner's performance expectations, and then how much money are we spending on a statewide basis, right? So if it was a program that we were spending over $10 million on versus one that we were spending $100,000 on, that $10+ million program would be prioritized more heavily. We also looked at discretely from how much money we were spending, how many locations do we have this service around the state? Because no matter the cost, if we're offering a service in many locations, that tells us that there's some level of importance or regular and ongoing utilization. So that was factored in as well. And then finally, but equally important in some ways, we ranked programs 1, 2, or 3 based on how hard it was going to be to get that work done. Not because we were looking to get around the work, but we wanted to grab some low-hanging fruit so that we could actually start out making some meaningful changes and getting our feet wet at the same time, not necessarily jumping into the most difficult situations. So that we ended up giving a double ranking to services. 1, based on those initial 3 priorities, how much money we spent, how close it was to the commissioner's performance expectations, and how many locations we had. And then we combined that with the level of difficulty. So a program that ranked very highly as far as its importance, combined with relative ease, i.e. it wouldn't take a ton of work to modify the performance measures, that got an H1, a high 1. And so we would start out with programs like that. So we had an H1, a medium level 1, 2, or 3, and then a lower priority 1, 2, or 3 as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And there is a question that came in around a timeline, and I hope that I'm interpreting this question correctly. And so the question is about from start to finish, how long did it take to begin to sort of identify the programs and then create the priorities around the program?
Well, it ended up actually the initial cataloging was not that long. You need 1 or 2 dedicated people who are willing to just jump in and do that work. That was done in a matter of weeks. The prioritization probably took a couple of months longer, and then actually developing the timeline and the training plan, again, a few more weeks, because the more you jump into the work, the more people begin to sit around the table. The entire process from saying, yes, this needs to happen, to having virtually all of our programs, again, we're talking about 100 different types of services. It was close to 2 years from the very beginning of the work to being able to say, yes, our network of programs, our whole service system really is based in RBA performance measures.
Okay, thank you.
Let me just add on to that, because it's interesting to me that in New York State, they did not the same cataloging process, but looked at over 130 different services, opportunities, and supports, prioritized them based on what most of the youth bureaus were using, came down to about 34 programs. They piloted some of the performance measures with just about 4 of those in a little pilot project, but once they really got into it, it was also about 2 years to get it to the point of having the performance measures that the different youth bureaus and programs could start collecting. And in Nebraska, depending on how you look at it, from the start of the training to getting the programs into the scorecard was probably closer to about 8 months.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question for both of you. In terms of when you create common measures across programs, what is your sense on the common tools for measurement? Did you all agree on those on the front end, or where does that idea come into play when creating common measures across different programs and agencies?
Can I take that one first, Ann?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so 2 examples. One, in New York State, we did a survey of the different providers to find out what they were currently using in each of these categories for each of the services, opportunities, and supports. So we didn't want, if people were already collecting this data, we didn't want to impose another measurement tool on them. Also in New York State, they don't want to give any unfunded mandates, so they don't really want to force any measurement tools on anybody. So they've provided, sort of did a compendium of each of those different Touchstone goal areas they have, and then each of the programs and the performance measures, kind of what that catalog Ann was showing, where it looked at what were some of the similar measurements across 6 different programs and what measurement tool might you use. In New York State also, they had been using the youth program quality assessment tool for some of their youth group programs and measurements, and then created their own program quality assessment using the youth program quality assessment tool. So a lot of people were already using that, but they still gave people the choice of different quality assessments, and then provided again, recommendations on the better off measures of different surveys or measurement tools that they might use. In Nebraska, that was where the providers also were very helpful in terms of what were they already using, and then the RBA work group did some research in terms of some other measurement tools. So I do think it's a really good, important thing that there is performance measures. What is it you're trying to measure, and then what is the tool that you're going to use? And Ann, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I just want to be clear that while I showed that example of a catalog that was a fairly common measures, what I do want to be clear about is the catalog of performance measures is designed to be used as a resource tool, so that if I have a new program or I'm newly developing performance measures for a program, I can look and see what similar programs have used for performance measures. So we were pretty specific in making the measures in that catalog generic, so that people wouldn't be locked into specific tools or very specific measurements based on one type of program over another, right? It's to help get people in the ballpark of, yes, this would be an important type of measure. I do want to say, especially when one is working with an evidence-based program or a fairly rigid model, it may not make sense to have generic performance measures. And we did not try to have common and generic measures across our different services, so that across our many program types, you could go into 30 different contracts and probably find 20-something different sets of performance measures. What you will see is that they all have a better off measure, they all have a how well or quality measure, and they all have measures on the amount of work or how much did we do. So it was really important that, and especially with the is anyone better off, that we had meaningful measures. But I don't want to give the impression that we tried to develop common measures across program to program to program.
Okay. Yes, thank you for that. So and just in the interest of time, I think we may have an opportunity for perhaps two more questions. And so there's a very pointed question. As it relates to identifying the fewest, most powerful performance measures and the collaborative process that was described, how do you balance tracking performance measures with also monitoring existing measures for other interests, such as the federal CFSR measures, consent decrees, etc.?
I'll take a stab at that first and then have Ann answer it. So when we talk about the fewest number of most powerful measures, and one of the ways we prioritize that is through what Mark Friedman calls communication power, proxy power, and data power. So you want to pick them based on things that you have good and reliable data for, first of all, that say something of central importance about your program, and that if you improve this performance measure, you'd improve a lot of the other performance measures. That's our proxy power. And then finally, that it has a good communication power, communicates to those people that you need to communicate to. So that's sometimes where what you may have to report to federal government, etc., or other funders may come into play. So you may actually collect more data than what I would call the headline performance measures that you look at on a regular basis. But also, hopefully, what people are asking you for does fit into those categories. You know, if you improve that, you're going to bring along a lot of the other performance measures. And then finally, what I'd like to say about it is that even if you have more data, you may not do this turn the curve process on every single measure. You may look at certain measures and then use those other data that you collect, we sometimes call secondary measures, to give you some feedback in terms of what are the contributing factors to this performance measure that you're looking at and trying to improve. And Ann, I'd like your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I agree with what you say, and especially using the exercise of the proxy power, data power, and communication power. I'd add on to that by saying some of the CFSR measures that I've seen are really quite good, in particular looking at quality, or how well did we do. And in my experience with consent decrees, which is has been varied, they often focus on how much and how well, and don't always focus on better off. And so I would encourage, of course, you've got to answer those data questions, and they're really important. You know, consent decrees they represent legal processes, and I think looking at better off answers a higher, if you will, a higher question, other than did we do everything we needed to do? Did we do what we were supposed to do? Did we do it as well as we should have? By asking the better off question, And did it make a difference? Are kids better off because we did all of these things? And so I would encourage people to, yes, of course, answer the questions that they need to answer, but don't forget the better off, even if it's not included in one of those other processes.
Great. And so I think we have time for one more question. I'll ask the question, and maybe Karen, you can wrap us up. And so the final question that we have is in terms of how do you manage sort of competing priorities and competing interests? When you invite so many different people to these community meetings, there's a lot of different interests that surface. And so in keeping things sort of focused on the results that we're looking to achieve sort of collectively, how do we balance and manage the room and the different dynamics at play in different community meetings when you have so many different stakeholders? And also internally, how do you build the capacity to do performance management well in terms of being able to do the quarterly reports or whatever the time period is that is specified to collect the data for performance measures? How do you build the capacity internally to manage performance well? And what do you do in the community meetings when you have so many different interests and so many different priorities all coming together when you're trying to, again, to use your language, Karen, to arrive at that moonshot?
Thank you. That's a complex question. Let me answer the community one, because you talked about the community convenings and various interests, and then the second part was like a capacity, which actually I might invite Ann to talk about actually, Ann, would you talk about the capacity around the quarterly reports and the performance measure, and then turn it back to me, and I'll do the different interests in the community convenings?
Sure. I would say start by understanding that change happens in baby steps. Change is hard, and it happens slowly. And understand that going in, and start out with training and support, and way more training and way more support than you possibly could imagine would be necessary. When you think you've said it the requisite 3 times, say it 3 more times for good measure, and then finish up with an extra 3 to 6 times, and be there for ongoing support. Celebrate those baby steps. But what I mean very practically by all that is we developed in-house training to help people change the way that they're thinking about developing reports and reporting, and moving from a process-oriented system and a compliance-oriented system to one that really gets to better off. We've developed a number of training tools in-house to help people make those changes and kind of go through that process. But realize, especially for those of us in funding agencies, is that we're asking ourselves and our coworkers to change the way that we think about not only what we report, but how we report it. So build in the capacity for people to slowly but surely understand that they need to start thinking differently. Give them the tools, and I mean specifically tools as in worksheets and workbooks, to make that change, and then train them and support them on a step-by-step basis.
Thank you. And I just want to echo one of the things you said is that thinking about this as not in addition to what you do, but it is what you do. And so how many staff meetings have you been in where it's just a lot, it seems to be a lot of talk and information exchange? Instead of having that, or in addition to information exchange, you can look at one measure at each staff meeting and spend that time, you know, looking at the story behind and trying to improve it. So include it in what you're already doing. In terms of competing interests in a community convening, I'll just say that one, I usually set up some guidelines in the beginning, but one of those guidelines is that as we look at actions, people in the community, you don't all have to agree on it. So people can take an action that they think is really going to make a difference on this measure and run with it in their particular community. If I'm using this community and then making it a part of a more ongoing strategic plan, then we usually have a step that after people come up with what works and what they propose to do for that particular result and indicator, then we usually have it on posters, have it around the room, or in other ways where people can learn what the other groups did and look for common themes, common strategies. And we've used different approaches to then prioritize, okay, what are those strategies that we're going to move forward in our county or community plan? And that doesn't mean, though, that people in the community can't move other actions forward. So that's the beauty of when you really bring people from the community looking at data for their particular community, and they can go out the next day and improve that. And one other thing I want to echo of what Ann said is the ongoing training, say it more than 3 or 4 or 10 times, and have tools. And so as we go into what you should do next, you're going to be sent a survey at the end of this webinar, and when you answer that survey, you'll get these PowerPoint slides in a PDF handout version. I've developed a workbook that I use in my RBA trainings that has a lot of these templates and forms in it that will help you with both the results, turn the curve on the community level, and also developing performance measures and turning the curve on the programmatic level. And then some performance measure examples. I caution a little bit on the performance measure examples, just as Ann said in their catalog. You should think of them as ways to kind of generate some thinking and spark some thinking, but not just taking them, you know, oh, these are great measures, let's use them here. That process of getting people involved in brainstorming what you're really trying to accomplish with your program and then prioritizing it is very key to getting not only people's buy-in, but also the best thinking for your particular program. So use it as examples, but please don't just, you know, they actually come from some of the work that we did in New York. And then finally, I think the last question or last comment on our survey, we would like to know, when I asked you early in this, what was your moonshot, what you were thinking of. And if you could just put that in the survey, really interested. It's hard to do webinars where you don't actually see people and, you know, get to have that interaction, but that'll give us a little bit of sense of what you're thinking. And I just want to also end by congratulating you all for the work that you do. It is so important, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of courage, and so keep up the good work, and if I can help you in any way, let me know. One last word from you, Ann, and then I'll turn it back to Marquez.
I'll pass on that. Thank you.
Okay. And Marquez?
Yes, thank you all for your time. We really appreciate it, and I look forward to following up. As Karen said, if there's any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. My name will be attached to the survey that you all will receive. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to following up soon.
Marquez, can I have one last thing? I can never stop.
Absolutely, Karen. Absolutely.
Ann, I just really, really want to thank you for being a part of this webinar. You know, she completely volunteered, and you made it so very, very real. So thank you very much.
Yes,
thank you, Karen.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.